Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Welcome back to another Field Trip Friday. I keep saying I'm so excited, but I am. If I could bounce up and down and skip around, I would, but it's kind of hard to do that when you're recording a podcast. We have our wonderful tour guide back with us, Jeremy Goldstein from the Trust for the National Mall. And today we're taking a tour called the Military Service and Veterans Tour. And I think that people are familiar with, the Vietnam Wall, the World War II memorials, the Korean War memorials. But today we're really just going to kind of talk about this, really looking at service, remembrance, and kind of collective healing. So, Jeremy, welcome back. When we're looking at this tour specifically, I think it always touches my heart. And I've shared in a previous episode that both my grandfathers were Korean War veterans. My family has a long history of military service, but it's always so wonderful to see veterans honoring their brothers, their sisters, whether it is in a conflict that they fought in, or they are just honoring people there. So how does each memorial approach the idea of remembrance differently?
Yeah, again, I appreciate being here for this conversation. As always, I love talking about the mall. I think the idea of remembrance gets sort of packaged in several different ways. And to use that term lightly, it's not about packaging, right? Each one of these memorials, the World War I, the World War II, the Korean and the Vietnam, they all have, different approaches to the somber reverence to conflict and war. There's always an underlying tone in any kind of memorial to a conflict or a war, that there's this underlying sort of mourning as well. People's lives were lost. Folks made the ultimate sacrifice. In addition, war's political aspect or piece was, is often represented there. One of the things that I find interesting about all of these memorials is the use of names of individuals. So the Vietnam War Memorial is a list of all the people who were lost from the American side, and the Korean has added names as well. You don't have those on the World War II and the World War I, although they do on Memorial Day read the names of those who were lost at the World War II. These long lists of names really give people an impact and an understanding. In addition, this remembrance becomes very individualized. There are people who recognize names on there. Personally, the Vietnam Memorial is a place that's a full circle for me. Just as kind of a sidebar, my first job out of graduate school, I worked for USA SILHI, the Central Identification Lab in Hawaii. I was an archaeologist before I was a school teacher, and I recovered the remains of MIA soldiers to bring back for identifications for final internment. And some of those names I recognize from the cases that I worked on in Southeast Asia. So I feel that individual weight of these places. And in addition, the design lends to that too. There's a conscious design. The World War II has these water features, the Gold Star Wall. The Korean has these larger than life-size statues and engravings of the images. And the World War I has this new relief that if you have the opportunity, it's a little bit off the beaten path, but it's part of the mall's collection. Go see the relief because it's the soldier's story. And it's very powerful, especially at sunset. And then, of course, the Vietnam Memorial as being sort of a digging out of the earth or kind of a large slice out of the plaza there next to the Lincoln. So the remembrance is different in design, but they all kind of go to that root of the somber reverence for the space for those who sacrificed and for those who came home as well as a space for that.
So you bring up the Vietnam Memorial. What makes that memorial's design so powerful?
Well, the 1982 dedication, I can remember when I was 12 years old. I'm dating myself. I can remember the cover of Newsweek talking about the architect who was selected. That's Maya Lin, or the designer who was selected. Very young, architectural student at the time. She turns out to be one of the larger forces in memorial design later on in her career, with a long, prolific career of really great public memorials. This one was controversial at the time because it was also, the 80s were still a tail end of the closure for the war. We had a whole generation of folks coming back. So there were a lot of emotions going on and a lot of opinions about how it should be represented. Every memorial needs to be enacted by an act of Congress and then supported by a commission and a friends group as well. The Vietnam Memorial has a very strong friends group because there's a full generation of veterans who are still around. We train the volunteers at the memorials and the monuments on the mall, and one of the strongest core of volunteers with many veterans is staffed at the Vietnam Memorial. That design is powerful because of a couple of things. And I am not an architect and I'm not a memorial designer. But when I step up to that wall and I see my reflection in there in the names and I see all the space that's dedicated to it, you're seeing yourself reflected as an individual. And you're also seeing these names as the depth of the memorial increases, these names increases by weeks of the war, showing the human toll. It is a very powerful space. In addition, there is the Soldiers Memorial. There's a three soldiers statue and the Vietnam Women's Memorial, which is both were later additions, but these are personifications of the individuals who were in Vietnam. So we see ourselves, we see the story of the veterans, and we also see the lives lost. And I think that's very powerful in the design.
It is. I remember seeing it for the first time and didn't feel the full power of it until I was kind of in the middle of the memorial and I could look to either side and kind of see that design and see all of these names. And you're right, the reflection of yourself is so incredibly powerful. I'm getting choked up even thinking about it because, one of the things is war and conflict is hard. So how can we commemorate and foster both pride and reflection in these memorials?
Well, I never had the honor of serving, but I worked for the Department of Defense. And one thing that I always told people is that regardless of how Americans feel about their military, these are individuals who signed up for something that, could possibly end in the ultimate sacrifice, in the ending of their lives. So a lot of people don't think about that when they think of people who decide to serve or enlist or who join the military, who trained in the military or who are drafted. These are individuals who have, this isn't just a job. This is a serious life choice. So I think we start with that. And there's pride in that decision, in that person has made that choice, the individual pride that they feel in representing one's country, representing the ideas of that country, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the era of serving. That's really the big piece. For reflection, I think folks who haven't served, I think people internationally, I think it's always good to meditate on and to reflect on what happens when dialogue breaks down and what happens when war occurs or conflict occurs, and how do we represent it? These memorials and monuments are narratives, and these narratives are very important to not only the American people but to humanity, to talk about what the ultimate cost is for individuals who engage in these conflicts, and also the toll it has on later generations and the people who come home from those conflicts.
And I'm so glad you bring that up because, again, I talk about my grandfathers, being Korean War veterans. Neither of them talked about it because Korea was kind of the forgotten war. And, the more we kind of dig into our family history, I had a great uncle who died at the Battle of Argonne Forest in World War I. He was a Danish citizen. Our family moved to America and he was killed. And that's when I learned more about Gold Star families and kind of the Gold Star tour. Like there's so many really incredible things that, bring me a lot of pride. But again, I'm like you. I did not sign up for service. My family has a long history. But then I feel like it is my responsibility to teach and to kind of uphold those civic values, that members of our military the men and women who have signed up for this, and even the ones who didn't sign up. A lot of them were drafted. It still is, fighting for a country and fighting for ideals. So when we're talking about civic values, what civic values are kind of embedded in these memorials?
Well, I love that you mentioned ideals, because those ideals are directly linked to our Constitution and that big agreement we all have here in the United States as that contract to be an American. People who defend that in the military are signing up to defend those ideals, defend the Constitution. I know that sounds like kind of a quote somewhere, but if I think about it, the key civic values are service and engagement, and civic engagement through service is really something that I love to impart to my students, and whether it's something that they do for their fellow American on a level that's not military, but the fact that we're all here together and we are here to support each other, I think that's an embedded value, is that these are individuals who are serving others, who are making sacrifices. And that's something that I feel every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day. I'm a big fan, and you're an Arizona person, so I'm a big fan of Senator John McCain. I was fortunate enough to work at a center that was named after him at his high school. But I always think of the quote, and I paraphrase, but John McCain always talked about engaging with or fighting for causes that are larger than yourself. And to me, that's what the mall feels like, a place that's larger than oneself. And then in addition to that packet of civic values that the mall and the front yard represents, that's something bigger than yourself. I believe in one of the first two episodes, I talked about feeling small in front of history. That's that similar feeling of things bigger than yourself. People who have been engaged in large events and large movements throughout our history. They're engaged in something. It's gigantic. It's written down. It's been interpretive. There's a narrative there.
It is. And I'm so glad you bring up Senator McCain. He is very much loved here in Arizona. And then we also have people like Pat Tillman, who left his NFL career. And I think that, when you talk about locally, right, because I think sometimes people think like, oh, DC, that's so far away. But a lot of times there are memorials in your cities and in your states. And then when you are able to come and do this military service and veterans tour, you can bring those, remembrances and those thoughts of the people locally. We have neighbors who are veterans, right? I think that, we all know someone who has served in the military. We know families who have lost people. And so this, having this pride in these men and women, but also being able to reflect and, see what you can do as a citizen if you are not in the military is so important. And I know I've said this in another episode, but I feel like it bears repeating. The Korean War monuments, to me, is so powerful because of the looks on those men's faces. And it reminds me that, I can date myself too. I'm 45, but it reminds me that a lot of these, men and women that went in were kids, really, in the scope of things. And so just having that remembrance and having that time. And I love that there are veterans that are working and talking to people and, especially on the Vietnam Wall, helping people find names and, create, what is it called? The etching of the names. And it's so powerful and it's so, sombering. And I think as we go into America 250, that is one of the things I know I personally want to carry in is an understanding of military service, of what our veterans have done and continue to do for our communities, and that real power of civic engagement. So I'm always so happy to go to the mall and have that time. It just is so powerful. I do want to ask, are there any other memorials? And I know that we have not prepped this, but are there any other memorials that are coming up? Because you talked about it takes an act of Congress. There has to be friends of, because I know somebody is listening going, well, what about, this war? What about this war? Are there any kind of on the horizon?
Yes, there are. And it's a good question. Before I answer that, I do want to say something interesting to me is that you mentioned the veterans who work on the mall. There's a large portion of veterans and veterans families who volunteer on the National Mall. We train and onboard the National Mall with the Park Service Rangers and onboard volunteers. And there is a very large contingent of people who continue to serve, who are in families of veterans. And that is significant. I think that speaks volumes for folks. I shadowed one of the veteran guides at the Vietnam Memorial, and very powerful moment. He said, every morning I walk down this memorial and I say hello to my friends. And that to me is one of the more significant, deep experiences that these memorials represent. On tap for upcoming memorials, we have the Desert Storm, Desert Shield Memorial, which is sort of being prepared and underway. In addition, there's an effort with the National War on Terror, the War on Terror as well. So these are two others, because that was a long war that had many inflection points. So these are two that are up. And then there's one other one that a lot of people don't realize is on there. It's perhaps one of the most popular places to get married on the mall, but it's a large pillared dome, and it is the World War I Memorial for the city of D.C. And those are people who sacrificed their lives from D.C. That was the first World War I memorial. And then later on, the Pershing Memorial became the plaza there became the World War I Memorial near the White House. So these memorials, and then there are other smaller ones for specific divisions and pieces there. Next to the World War II, there is an FDR Prayer Memorial, which I think is significant as well. So these are all things to think about. If you're not going in person on the mall, I would suggest taking this tour with our 360s on the National Mall Gateway, gateway.nationalmall.org. That's my final plug there.
Yes, no, and it'll be in all of the show notes. And teachers, especially, as you get close to Memorial Day or Veterans Day, I think that this is a great tour to take with your kids if you're in a classroom. And I love that you can take that on the website and have kids kind of look at this, because not everybody can make it to DC, but I love that the National Mall is still accessible to the masses through the website. So, Jeremy, thank you so much. I am more than stoked to go on more field trip tours with you.
Thank you. And I love talking about the mall, so I'm really looking forward to our next episode.
Yay!
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.